Hey everyone, and welcome to your favorite YouTube series. Mine as well. I think it's Anthony's, Lloyd's. We're trying to get David converted over. We'll see by the end of his episode. Anyways, episode 17 of Not Another Demo. We are really excited this week to have with us. And for those of you West Michigan folks, you may recognize this fellow here. We've got David McClure with us from Cloudflare. Of course, I've got Anthony and Lloyd from the really bad security crew with me as well. We are minus Aaron Brigg this week, so it'll probably be a little shorter, but we will undoubtedly miss him in spirit. So a lot of you may know Cloudflare from DNS or CDN technologies and security, but we wanted to bring David on because Cloudflare has moved into some other areas that I think are super interesting, and very, very relevant. So we are going to talk with him today about securing and enabling your remote workforce. And then also some remote browser and some other technologies that Cloudflare is working on. So David, I'll pass it over to you to do a brief introduction. And then, the first question I do always like to ask is, at a time where I feel like we've got so many different vendors to look at, where we have so many people trying to get meetings on our calendars, why would someone want to carve out an hour of their day to talk with you and Cloudflare about what you're doing?
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I guess quick intro, like you said, I'm actually a Michigan native. I was on the east side of the state for many, many years. I ended up moving down to Florida, spent some time in ed tech, came back to West Michigan, which I have to admit is the prettier side of the state, even though I was not born and raised there. But yeah, beautiful. Loved hanging out in Grand Rapids for a couple of years, but I made the move now down in Austin, Texas, with Cloudflare at one of their. Eventually, it'll be at one of their office locations. For now, it's remote, but enjoying a little more snow or a little more sunshine, a little less snow, but yeah. So to your question, obviously, I went down and joined Cloudflare, and there's a reason for that, and as I kind of looked at the landscape and the different companies I work with, I used to build products and services for a company there locally, and we leveraged these different third-party vendors. And when we were building these services, and so the underlying platforms were something I spent a lot of time on, and Cloudflare was one of those. And as I started to work with them, I think there's probably 4 to 5 things that really stand out to me, just as far as who they are as a company and kind of what makes them relevant and worth paying attention to, if you will. First thing is their mission. This is a security podcast, right? This is the primary focus. Their mission's bigger than that, though. It's just broad. Let's make the internet better, right? It's this huge mission. I don't even know how you deliver on it at first when you start to think about it. But in order to do that, you have to define what better would be, right? And so as you break down better for us, really, we've kind of defined it in this way where we're trying to improve security, but also performance, reliability, visibility, control, privacy, and try to make all these things easier to obtain. Right. So it's still a pretty big mission, but at least now we got some boundaries for it. Right. But that mission really drives everything that we're doing here. And so, when we look at just the industry as a whole, and I've even on, I think some of the episodes I've watched, we've talked a lot about, I've seen people talk about this trade-off that always exists, right? There's always, you can have more security, but you're going to get a little less performance, or you can have greater control, but it's more complex to implement. And so there's always these trade-offs that we're balancing out as we're trying to solve these different business problems as security professionals. For us, we do something a little bit different, I think, and we kind of take this different approach where, like for our product org, they talk about the power of and that's actually really important. It's kind of one of those core DNA items here. And with the power of what we're saying is we're going to give you security and performance. We're going to give you reliability, or we're going to give you visibility, and we're going to give you control. You don't have to give one up to get the other. And so we try to design and build all our products that way, which brings out some really interesting offerings. So when we talk about, what people know us most for, things like the CDN and the DNS and the WAFs and all these core products to protect websites and applications. We're always going, we're going to give you security and performance, and we deliver on that. We're also giving you visibility and control, and we're going to make it as easy as we can. We're going to do things like a couple clicks and you got SSL. So that's always baked into how we build out products. So the next thing beyond that power of and, I would say, is probably the underlying network. Most companies out there that are building their platforms, they tend to come from a background where, let's say you're a CASB vendor or you're a firewall vendor, and you kind of have a core competency that you're really good at. And this gets a lot into that whole best of breed thinking, right? A lot of people have this best of breed singular product, and that's what they designed and built. And then something comes along, like, you know, we probably talk a little bit SASE later, but when SASE comes along, you have a lot of people that look at it and say they have a particular pain point that hits a particular product, and that's the best of breed. And so then they make a decision. Well, Cloudflare is a little bit different in that our best of breed piece, if you will, that thing that underpins everything is the network that we built. And most of these companies don't have anything like that. They haven't put the investment there because it's incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult to engineer that.
Can we quickly get you to define that acronym since we've used it now?
Oh, did I say the SASE acronym or which one?
Yeah.
So Secure Access Service Edge, and that's you know, I'm sure people are at least loosely familiar now, but Gartner coined the term. And basically what they're saying is there's going to be this hybrid of network and network security in one platform that's cloud delivered. And so there's a whole definition around that. There's core products in it that go in it, but that'd be a lot more acronyms that I don't still want to define for the moment.
Well, you answered the most important question. That's how do you pronounce Secure Access Service Edge?
So it's definitely pronounced SASE. That is in the original write-up. So
perfect.
You got it straight from Neil McDonald. We're good.
I do feel like it's a term though that, you know, we hear a lot, but I think there's less understanding than there, like real understanding of it than there is, you know, people using the word. So, you know, another reason why I thought this is a very relevant conversation, you know, and hopefully we can dive a little bit deeper into like what that actually really means and can do for an organization as well.
Yeah, happy to do that. Do you want me to do that right now, or do you want me to finish the last couple of points, or
why don't we finish off the points, and as long as you don't use any more acronyms, we won't interrupt you.
I will make sure that so the underlying network, that's kind of everything's built on that at the end of the day, and we can readdress that probably a little bit later anyways. But the other thing that we talked about earlier, just I think, you know, in side conversations and things, is the velocity of innovation that we have here. It's one of the hardest things for me to keep up with. And I didn't say it, I work as a technical product marketing manager, so don't let the marketing part turn you off if you're listening. But the velocity of innovation here is almost impossible to keep up with, even for me sometimes, being internal. And I know what's going on, I know what's coming, but we put stuff out so fast because at our core, we're an engineering company. Like, that's what we're founded on. We engineer things and we solve problems. And our product team is focused on solving problems. That's what we do. So, you know, that's just something where we innovate so quickly. Like I said, it's hard for people to keep up with what all we even do. And that's one of those key, I view that as a key differentiator. But yeah, we can elaborate on that maybe in the future. So yeah, those are probably the key things. But yeah, to your point on SASE then, so I'll circle back to that. So I've defined that so I can use it. SASE really consists of a handful of things, but I guess let's talk about the underlying why SASE is a thing, because that's probably the most important piece for someone to understand. When when they coined that term, what was going on is that, you know, if you guys are all going through this, I know a lot of you guys are practitioners and/or you're helping people, you know, solve those problems, you know, on the other side of the aisle. Everybody's in the same situation where, you know, and COVID accelerated parts of it, but they basically all your workloads and all the different data points that you have all started moving all over the place. Like, it's become like you have data that used to just sit inside of an office, and now it's in some SaaS application. Now it's in a cloud-based data center. Now, whether you've co-loaded or whether you've actually just strictly started consuming some type of multi-tenant cloud infrastructure, maybe you got a private cloud setup. You have some sort of cloud dependency at this point for pretty much everybody. I've only talked to, and I can say this honestly, in the last 3 to 4 years, I've talked to exactly one customer that didn't have cloud. And it actually baffled me. And they were a bank, but they were a bank of millionaires. That's what I remember about them.
And they probably had some stuff that was in the cloud that they didn't realize it. I think.
Yeah, right. Probably.
Something.
That's the only one that it's ever like, I was kind of like going, maybe you don't. That's bizarre.
Yeah,
like, no portal, it was pretty, but everybody else does. That's just the reality of it. And even beyond that, like we're using browsers and going out and doing research, and there's all these access points either way, and because we're all connected, at the end of the day. So data started moving out of the traditional data center, right? And it started becoming more difficult to control. And then the places that it's being accessed also are all over the place now. And that's why I said COVID accelerated that, because everybody moved outside of the traditional office space that, we're in the past, you could have somebody inside your network, right? You could, they're down inside, they're on the LAN, they're able to see what's going on there. Accessibility is all controlled. Like it's very easy to control that when it's all inside of this neat little box. But when you start throwing little boxes everywhere, it becomes a lot harder to control. And so what typically happens in anything like this is we start fixing the small problems one by one. And so we go, well, we have this problem. So we come up with this little solution and we throw another box at it. And we got this new hardware solution that we put in, and then, oh, I know what we can do. We can VPN back and still use the same stuff. That's the easiest route, right? And so we start doing that, and it kind of works for a time, but then at some point it becomes this big tangled mess, and the performance starts becoming really, really, poor, and the complexity becomes really difficult. You start getting, locked in with different vendors because you're so intertwined with what they're doing, like you can't get out of it. Like it just starts creating all sorts of problems. And so, we didn't design, and this happens across the internet all the time in my mind. Like every time we get new innovation, we look at the internet and we say, it wasn't, we set out with one way of thinking, and it wasn't designed for 10 years down the road and 15 years down the road, because we didn't know what was going to be coming. As we've accelerated what the internet can do and how fast everything is and how connected everything is, the landscape's changing underneath us. And so these adaptations that we do over time, like, yeah, they work in the short run, but in the long run, they're not a good solution. So the guys kind of identified this. They said there's this inversion, right? So data's now moving outside of where we would traditionally would be able to control it, inside of, as I said, a corporate location or on-prem type data center. It's moved outside of that. And then the users have also moved outside of our control, and they're out there, and so all this stuff is kind of floating around out there, and we're and we have this expanding network perimeter that we can't really control and protect. So how do we do that? And that's kind of the, where the idea was kind of founded from, or birthed from, if you will.
So how do you guys, so where does Cloudflare fit into that picture?
So where Cloudflare fits into that, obviously we see the same problem. What's interesting for us is that we started setting out to solve these problems too before SASE was even coined as a term. And we launched Access probably shortly after, which is our Zero Trust Network Access product, ZTNA. We launched that, and then COVID hit, and kind of things got real crazy. But we had already started down this path of solving the remote workforce problem with that product. We also have a product called Gateway, which is a secure web gateway, which users can connect to, and then we can actually provide protections for those end users regardless of location. And so we started working on this suite of products that essentially are SASE before it was necessarily defined. And what we've seen in this space, I guess, is there's a lot of companies like a Palo Alto, like they had a bunch of these disparate solutions and they threw them together, so you can kind of do SASE, and I kind of call it a Frankenstein model, but you can kind of make it work. But where we come from is this, we've been building a platform in this integrated fashion. It's a cohesive platform. And again, it all comes for us from trying to solve customer problems. I mean, that's where we sit at the end of the day. It's, what do people need out there? What can we do? And how can we leverage our network and our engineering abilities to solve these problems?
It sounds like there's some cost benefit there. Like, you mentioned VPN and putting people inside your network to connect to services and kind of getting away from that. So, it sounds like a roll up of a service offering that could potentially have cost benefit. as you're looking at your budget. So can you speak to that at all? Like, how does this provide you with some cost savings over doing it the traditional way that we do in most cases today?
Yeah. So, when you think about, let's think about traditional architecture, right? We have different firewall appliances. Maybe you got the Palo Alto Network firewalls or something, and you got a Fortinet box, and you're doing SD-WAN, and you're doing you start deploying all these different technologies on top of your, on top of your legacy stack, right? So you got that stuff sitting there, and you start VPNing people back in to run through all that equipment. What you're dealing with then is number one, you got a bunch of CapEx, right? You got a bunch of appliances you got to manage. And every time you add locations, you got to add more appliances. So there's that part of the equation. There's the bandwidth part of the equation, right? As you start backhauling traffic, like all of a sudden now you have a lot more traffic coming in and out of your data center. So now you're paying more for that. And then you're still dealing with needing to do things like endpoint security and stuff for the user. So you're paying for a whole bunch of different things. When you start doing a solution like ours, we don't have a VPN component anymore. There's nothing that needs to live inside of somebody's data center anymore. So you rip out all that CapEx and you rip out those boxes, and now you start going to a cloud-based service. And so you start to get all the benefits of the cloud. I would say the biggest thing for us from a cost benefit savings, beyond just being able to get rid of all those CapEx appliances that you're managing, is the fact that it scales up and down. And this was huge this year. You guys probably dealt with this. Like your users went from, we have a VPN covering 20 employees to all of a sudden we got to cover 100. That's a big difference. And I remember where I was working at before, we were selling them like hotcakes. Like it was just like, we couldn't get enough, bundles. We'll call them bundles. We were buying them in chunks of VPN connections for customers. You don't have to do that with a cloud-based service. It scales up and down. The way our pricing model even works on for our workforce components, for access and for gateway, is seat-based. So it's how many users are actually using it this month. How many people actually use it? That's what you paid for. And so when you have 10 or 15 people that get laid off, and you're in an unfortunate situation like that because you're struggling because of COVID, well, guess what? Your bill goes down. It doesn't stay the same. It doesn't, you don't go end of life all of a sudden on, and need to update this year in the midst of all the chaos. Like those things don't happen anymore. So you get rid of a lot of those problems. So the scalability and flexibility is huge as well.
So,
Equation.
so you've mentioned, quite a lot actually. So
I'm making up for Brett.
yeah, I'm just gonna ask the how question. So, if you're, if I'm able to rip out all these boxes, well, what's the technical side of that look like? Am I setting up something in my network that connects back to Cloudflare's cloud, that all that traffic is proxied through and back to? Like what does that look like on the back end?
Even let's take a one step back from that. Even let's say I am on top of that, I'm the user, and I'm I'm in a hotel, or I'm at home, or I'm wherever, and I'm logging in. What does that look like? What are the
What's the user experience?
What happens when I try to access something? Like, what does that look like technically?
Yeah, so I'm going to use the concept of location a little bit differently and to describe this. Traditionally, location is headquarters, branch office, things like that. And then we talk about remote users being remote users. They're not really a location. In the context of SASE specifically, you have to think of location a little bit differently. Every user, every point where data is accessed, modified, deleted, anytime it's interacted with becomes a location. So an end user on a device now becomes a location. Just like a branch office is a location, just like corporate headquarters is a location, just like your data center is a location. They're all locations. And what you end up with then is trying to manage the on-ramps to a SASE platform. So if you roll out a full SASE platform and you have the full network connectivity, those on-ramps are going to be different depending on what location we're talking about. So for us right now, our primary primary on-ramps that we're using involve our Magic Transit product. If you guys aren't familiar with that, if you're familiar, are you guys familiar with like Arbor Networks, like in what they do from a DDoS perspective? Okay, so usually they're on-prem appliances that are figuring out what's going on in your network, and then if there's a problem, they'll actually do a BGP route. They'll announce BGP for you. Basically, they'll announce your IP blocks, and then they'll create a GRE tunnel back to your network and scrub your traffic and go through all that. Magic Transit is kind of a similar concept to the rerouting and scrubbing pattern, except for it's always on. It's not based on a appliance on-prem. So you can connect over Magic Transit. Essentially, we'll announce your IPs, and then we'll route traffic back to you. And the global scalable network comes into play there. So that's one on-ramp for corporate headquarters, data centers, things of that nature. When you're talking about the end user, though, to your point, Matt, that right now, there's a number of ways you can do that depending on what you're trying to protect. But the primary thing that we're doing with end users right now is agent-based. So we have something called a Warp client. And we've used Warp for a few things in the past, but we keep adding functionality to it. But what the Warp client does, I have it on my desktop right now that I'm using the beta browser, and I just toggle it on. And what happens when I do that is it creates an encrypted tunnel between my machine and the nearest Cloudflare POP. So, and because we have over 200 of those globally, so something's always close, right? And so when that happens, now I have this is where it gets really fun to me. So if we're using something like Access, which is really designed around identity and access control for whether it's internal applications or whether it's Access even supports things like RDP, or whether it's a SaaS application, I can take something like Access and I can require that my end user is using the Warp client to access something. And then the Warp client includes is connected to our secure web gateway product. So I can ensure that that endpoint is actually going through all the policy it needs to go through, that it's being protected the way it needs to, that this machine is actually one of the machines that is deployed and connected to my organization when I also am doing the identity. So I get the identity and the context, basically. But that client is to me the primary deployment that we're going to use. Now you can go and use something like Access without a Warp client, and you can use individualized components. But when we're talking about SASE right now, that client is probably the strongest version, if you will, of what we can provide. And it all goes around that idea of integrating things together.
So for that, do you guys support the major IDPs for authentication? So Azure, Okta, all the big names.
Yeah, and even just like SAML as in general. So yeah, there's a whole page. I can't remember all of them. There's 30 plus listed, I think, on the page of the ones we do support. We're also doing things like endpoint detection and response type integrations with like CrowdStrike and some of these companies. We're doing some really cool things there as well. But yeah, from an IDP standpoint, we're not an IDP. Right. I should say that probably really plainly. We work with them, which is nice because, again, you don't have to necessarily rip and replace that if you have that set up and configured, you can just work with it. So I find that part to be rather nice. It tends to make the journey a lot easier. But
so when we talk about, we just kind of talked about user experience and some things like that. But let's look at the flip side. What's the administrative experience like? Does it kind of help with operational overhead? Does it streamline things? Does it add complexity? How does this help your IT operations, streamline their cloud?
See, this is where an SE should be doing a demo.
I knew I was going to get a little too in the weeds, but
no. No, if you go back to what I was saying at the very beginning, when you're kind of like, why should somebody care about Cloudflare, pay attention? The power of and, right? That's always the focus. And part of that is ease of use. And so this, like, if you were to go do an Access integration, like, you can literally set it up in minutes. Like, it can be that fast, for smaller companies, I would say. As you get a little bit bigger, though, it goes up to maybe a week. Like, it is really easy. And that's only because if you have that many users and you really want to build that many policies and start to do more of the refinements, it can extend a little bit. But no, it's actually very easy to use. It's a true, when you build a solution, I know I alluded to Palo Alto Networks, and I'm not picking on them because they have great technologies. So I'm not disparaging anybody. But when I made the comment about them kind of having a Frankenstein solution, the problem you run into there is, like, yes, they have this really good thing and they have that really good thing, and you can use them all and technically check boxes, right? You can say, and most people that don't understand the SASE platform, they when they come to us, they say, here's my checkbox of all of the SASE components, and do you have these things? And they don't think about the platform, like, you kind of want to flip that and go, yeah, you need to have those things, but the platform is actually more important and the integration is more important. And so when you start talking about, like, actually setting it up and using it, for us, it's a true single pane of glass. which gets really fascinating. It's not you need to use this management plane and this management plane or individual things. It's actually one and it's integrated together. So if you go onto ours right now, like you can go set up access and gateway, and you can have policies. Like I was saying before, you can use gateway policies and access policies together. You can create lists of users and lists of apps and all these different things, and they're available across the different products. So the management side of it's actually very, very simple. And you know, again, there's different levels of the product too, but even all the way up enterprise, it's kind of, it's almost, sometimes it feels like it's too easy to me. Like compared, you know, like it's kind of like everybody's like we don't do managed services and so we have a lot of service vendors that go out there and help customers because, you know, for the most part, a lot of our stuff doesn't always require that. What really people really benefit from the, you know, service providers is actually the design, planning, implementation, and just understanding what it is. That's where they get more benefit, I think, than the ongoing management setup. The ongoing management setup is actually the easy part sometimes, or most of the time with us, I would say.
So David, we talked about, you know, endpoints and locations and things like that. So I mean, if people are, you know, they might be using their laptop, they might be accessing stuff from their phone, they might be accessing stuff from a tablet or whatever. When it comes to, I mean, are all of those sorts of things supported? I mean, does it matter what I'm connecting to that data from? Is Cloudflare able to, you know, get me to the secure path back home or out to the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, we work cross device. I don't know any specifics that we don't work with at the moment. And again, it comes back to which location we're talking about. If we're talking end user and end user devices, again, you throw a Warp client on there and you're off and running. And even our remote browser that I know we kind of want to talk about too, that's actually baked in right now. And we're going to do different versions of this stuff as we continue to innovate, but browser is actually integrated right in the Warp client. So if you have browser enabled on your organization, you turn the Warp client on, you can actually have within the gateway product, within that secure web gateway, you can actually have controls in there that say isolate this versus that don't isolate these things, and actually set all that up. But yeah, it doesn't really matter device wise. And then again, if your corporate network has the same exact policy and same exact controls on it as well, like, you know, there's that side of it as well. But yeah.
So how about, I think the other thing that you know, I think we're going to see a lot of this year, right? We talked about how COVID happened and a lot of in-person workers went remote. Now, I think as, you know, things settle back down, hopefully this year, you know, we start seeing people moving back in, and, you know, where that settles, we'll see. I think a lot of companies will end up with a bit of a hybrid of people working on-prem and people working remotely. What would I mean, is there, if we're making, say, an investment in Cloudflare, because right now we have a lot of remote people, so we need this SASE technology, is there also benefits if we're on-prem, or does that go back to that, you know, we scale up and we scale down depending on the situation?
Yeah, from what I've seen, if you're out there, like the companies that are out there that are looking at SASE, most of them have very specific pain points they're trying to deal with now. And they're looking at it in this more holistic, like, what is it people are talking about it kind of way. I haven't seen a lot of people come. There's been a handful or a small percentage. Most people don't come in and say, I want SASE right now. Really, they're coming to us and they're saying, I have, like you're describing, a very specific problem around the remote workforce, right? That is an individualized component of SASE. It's one of the problems it can solve. But it's not necessarily the whole picture. And that's what we see a lot of. And so most people are actually coming to us and they're wanting like a roadmap. Like we see SASE as the future. Like they start to understand, yeah, you're right, but we can't do all. It's a huge lift to even begin to do that. But here's the problems we have right now that we need to solve. And so we end up starting with things like I said, access is probably our most popular entry point. Where we have people that are dealing with, again, they have all these people accessing these things from all over the place. They need to be able to enforce MFA across the board, or they want to look at context a little bit more. Then the next step they goes, well, now we need to secure those end users too. We need to make sure that they're protected, you know, on these different endpoints that they're using. And so then the gateway part starts to come into play. And what's really interesting, I think, in that context, when we talk about location, if everything's a location of one and you provide the same policy, the same same policy enforcement, the same controls, the same everything across all these locations, it actually gets to the point where it no longer matters where people are from a security standpoint. You go in one place, you make one change, and it's everywhere. And that's what people are after. So most people start with those two steps kind of in tandem. And that's kind of what we see right now.
Other than like access and a couple of other, ones you've mentioned, do you have other real world use case examples where you could really take advantage of something like this? Like what's beyond the next steps?
Is you say without talking about access, you're talking about different products, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so you solve the problem of access. Are there any other things that the secure access service edge could do? Like when you start talking about all the things it encompasses, great, I solved access. Is there anything else that I can get value wise out of going with something like this?
Oh yeah. I mean, access is kind of tip of the iceberg stuff. I think one of the really powerful features that like we're building in, because of the way we deploy things, right? So you think about our big network, we have, the 200 plus cities, 200 plus points of presence and growing. I don't even know where the number is most of the time because they just keep adding, which is great. But every one of those POPs has servers running in it that are essentially the same basic server stack with all the same technology running on it. And that applies to all of our product set. So what happens there is we can do things like deploy firewall as a service for a company. And that same firewall that's operating for gateway for the end user is the same one that's operating for a customer who's using our Magic Firewall product through Magic Transit, for example. And so when you start talking about SASE, about on-ramping the corporate network, and then you on-ramp the users, the really cool part, and probably my favorite version that we're going to see people move to at some point more broadly, especially your larger organizations, just picture that. I guess picture this with me. You have your corporate headquarters and whatever you got on-prem there directly connected to the Cloudflare network through Magic Transit with Magic Firewall running. And let's say it's cloud, like a bunch of your stuff is cloud hosted, and we do a PNI and directly connect to the Cloudflare network. That traffic now runs.
Real quick, what's PNI? Sorry.
Oh, PNI, private network interconnect. If you go onto Cloudflare, you'll see the Cloudflare network interconnect, the CNI, but it's a PNI with Cloudflare. Really simply put. So if you do that, it's that direct line, right? We're plugging in, so we're directly connected now. You take that now, so now all the data that's inside of your data center that's sitting, that your customers need to access, that needs to get out there, is now directly connected to Cloudflare. On the other end, we have users using the Warp client with that encrypted tunnel up to the nearest POP. Now they're directly connected to Cloudflare.
So it never leaves Cloudflare's network.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now Cloudflare, the network edge is now Cloudflare's network edge, right? So you now take that. So now you get the size, the scale, the performance, the security, all those things that the Cloudflare network offers now sit in front of all of your things. And not just that, this is the part, I don't know if I get told to be careful treading here, so I'm going to tread lightly. But if you have a PNI and you go directly to end users at any location, you no longer are using a whole lot of transit. And people don't think about this. And you're actually using our transit at that point. Right. And so a lot, like you can actually so you can get bandwidth savings out of that. You're going to get performance optimization out of that. So a lot of that, in my mind, when we talk about things like SD-WAN, is because SD-WAN's a software-defined WAN, wide area network. We good? Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
So when you talk about SD-WAN technology, you can actually replace that potentially, depending on your setup. There's some situations where it might make sense to keep it. But I won't get.
So because that's kind of what my current big question is how do we get feature parity, right, from what we're used to this new architecture? At that point do site to site VPN tunnels become moot, because that can all be set up within Cloudflare's routing. If I need to go from one site to the next, is there a true feature parity between, right, I either have traditional firewall architecture, or I have firewall plus SD-WAN, or some hybrid of the two, whatever. Are you really able to provide that true one-for-one feature parity?
Yeah, well, so two answers to that. Number one, when I talk about feature parity, you can check boxes or you can talk about problems to solve. So if we're talking about problems to solve, we don't have full feature parity on every single use case yet. but we're working on it, kind of thing. And we're pulling people, so we're pulling people into that. So that's one side of it. If we're talking about checking boxes on individual items, that gets a little muddy, and I would say no. But because like I'm dealing with this with some big customers right now, where they're like, what about quality of service? What about latency optimization? What about, like, they have all these boxes to check. The reality is if you connect to the Cloudflare network, you get those things. Like latency is reduced just by the nature of being connected to our network. I don't need an SD-WAN appliance to do it for me. Quality of service over the internet's kind of irrelevant in my mind. Like that's not really a thing that I'm aware of. So that's more of an internal thing.
Yeah, so QoS can be a thing, especially with voice. So if you have multiple locations that are using your voice services that are hosted in your data center, then that could be important to you. But with movement to soft phone and things of that nature, it's becoming, less so, but there still are those legacy services there.
Gotcha.
But, one probably my favorite Cloudflare stat is you guys have like 1/3 of the internet traffic in the world goes through Cloudflare.
And that's, I love we're within 100 milliseconds of 99% of like the internet connected world.
Right.
Pretty fast. I mean, that's amazing statistic, and
Yeah.
I look at some of our competitors sometimes that are, and usually our competitors, they're a competitor in one area and then maybe another area, but they're not competitors across what we do.
Right.
But they have 8 pops in North America or something like that, and they're doing pretty good. And it's like we have more than that on the Eastern Seaboard.
Right.
Just the United States.
Yeah, somebody I know who's a Cloudflare enthusiast told me that when Cloudflare mitigates a DDoS, your Cloudflare's internet bill actually goes down because the traffic going in and out actually equalizes a little more, and therefore you guys are actually paying less, which is I think quite humorous.
Yeah, it is. And the other thing that we get because of that scale, we get to deal a lot with the international powers that be, we'll say. It's really hard for them to create problems because we accelerate their entire country in a lot of cases through our connectivity. And we've seen use cases of this where certain countries are like, we're going to turn off Cloudflare because you're supporting a site that we don't like, that's against our government, for example, things like that. And they try to pull the plug, and then their entire internet just kind of breaks and crumbles a little bit because, and so we're able to provide that, again, we're trying to make the internet better for everybody at the end of the day, not just some people who pay more money. And so, and you can, if you want to check me on that, go look at all the things we offer for free, which is pretty much our entire product portfolio. And so, it's that same, kind of democratization of the internet that we're after in a certain sense, because we think it's.
So I do want to make sure we touch on the browser isolation aspect real quick. So just give a quick elevator pitch on that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so browser technology, and I've said this is not I'm still learning a lot around this one. It's fascinating technology. Underlying problem it solves is pretty simple. It's the threat of the unknown. So when you think about the use case for browser isolation, why you need to do it, browsers are inherently security risks. They're probably the number one conduit, right, for problems, if you will. And so when you isolate a browser, you run it inside of a secure environment, essentially, that is, isolated from the endpoint device. Therefore, the bad things in theory can't get into the device. There's a few different ways to do this. You can do this through pixel pushing, which is essentially video streaming what's actually happening. It's what a lot of like remote type instances look like that people are familiar with. Performance is pretty much terrible. It costs a ton of bandwidth. And it even be a costly solution. So, but it is secure. I'll give it that. Definitely secure. The second one is usually some form of DOM manipulation where you're scrubbing out potentially bad things, and then kind of sending the page back through after the fact. That one creates rendering issues. It's a little bit fragile, the way I look at that. It also is still kind of based on the traditional security model of what do we know is a problem.
Right.
Whenever you're scrubbing, you have to know what to scrub, right?
You're looking for hashes and IOCs and things of that nature. So, but if it doesn't match that, you might still get a scrub page that has malicious content.
Right. And so there's always the chance of 0 days getting through or having some issues, basically. So security is still better than not using it, but it's not, it's not a silver bullet. And so,
That's slightly less egregious than single pane of glass, which
Yeah.
you did get a grimace from Anthony for using that one earlier.
Hey, it's true, man. I'm gonna own it. No, so what Cloudflare did is they acquired a company called S2 Systems about a year ago. So this is around time, people were starting to kind of pay attention to this for remote browser. But what they do essentially to make it as simple as I can is all web pages, like when you actually open up a browser, they're all built with the same like they're all rendered the same way. Like that's a known value. So, and if anybody's a former web developer nerd, and you want me to say a little more, I will, but I can only go so far. But basically the rendering, like the actual drawing on the screen of what everything looks like is all done from the same thing. Everything else, though, you can essentially intercept, like if there's code running on the background, you can actually run that in an isolated environment. You can fetch whatever it's trying to fetch. You can essentially build the whole thing in a remote browser and then send the rendering instructions down to the browser. What we decided to do is kind of take that line of thinking and we created a native experience, because I guess the biggest problems with browser is you get a performance trade-off or security trade-off, and then you have end user adaptability and usability. That becomes the number one issue. And so if you have a solution that is terrible on performance, nobody wants to use it. If it causes them to have to change behavior too much, they're not going to use it.
Right.
And so it gets really fascinating where you have to solve the problems. You have to bring that and thinking to it. And so what we've done is we've basically built a solution that will still render the page. It still uses page render. It actually uses a compressed version that actually reduces bandwidth rather than going up, which is fascinating. But it renders the exact same page inside of somebody's browser without them knowing any better. And the same rendering that is used to render the actual like web page content is the same thing that actually renders the browser window itself. So the UI that they're using, the browser itself and the web page inside of it is all rendered identical and all has the same things available, if you will. It's a seamless experience. It's just the execution side of things is happening in an isolated environment.
Is that isolated environment Cloudflare's like pop?
It's on cloud, yeah, so it's living on Cloudflare's edge. So it's a containerized instance on Cloudflare's edge.
So
in theory is very close to the user, right?
Yeah. So I guess the question that first becomes top of mind is, especially now when we are pushing for password managers and things of that nature, how is that browser still configurable? Can I install a LastPass or 1Password extension on that browser? Because if I can't, then I can't use it.
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. I believe that you can use all that. I'm actually trying to go back because I'm betaing it myself and been using it like just for fun. Yeah. And I don't know off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure you can. I just don't want to commit to that answer.
Sure.
I want to make sure, but it does, to my knowledge, everything that I've seen right now is it's a native experience. The only thing is that if you're mid-session, it'll break your session. I do know that if you turn it on all of a sudden. But if you have, let me think here. I'm going back from my own experiences and trying to remember if I used, because I have LastPass and I don't remember if I've used it. So I'll have to test that one and get back to you.
Yeah, for sure.
But in theory, it's supposed to provide a full native experience where you're actually using everything within the browser, all the different controls that are in Chrome. You can hit Control-Shift-I and it will actually take that input and still execute, and right. You can see everything the same. But yeah, there is definitely, you're no longer using your native browser with everything that's on it. You're using our browser. So there is that side of it. Mm-hmm. So you're not, to my knowledge, I don't think you're installing extensions and things of that nature necessarily. But no, I take that back. Because you're using your native browser on your device, you have what's inside your browser.
Okay.
The actual execution is happening is a different browser in theory, and then you're getting the rendering instructions back. So everything that you can do within your native browser should be supported within the isolated browser, because it's still actually occurring locally. You're just then pushing the command side of it down to the remote browser.
Okay. So do you have to use a specific client to use this, or can you use your, I'm using Google Chrome right now. So if I have the, I'm sorry, I already forgot the name. The package, installed on my PC and it's on. do I just launch Chrome like I normally would, and then it starts, and if I have browser isolation enabled, it starts pushing that to Cloudflare, or do I need a specific, icon on my users' desktops for this to work?
No, so again, in the spirit of user behavior, warp client's on, browser is active in theory in this implementation. It's as simple as either the warp's on or the warp's off.
Okay.
What happens though, as far as whether isolation occurs or not, actually depends on the policies that you've built. So if you're going back to gateway, if you have a secure web gateway and you've put policies in there, some of the options for those policies can be if somebody goes to sites that are, we deem to be unsecure for some reason, and there's lots of ways to do that, we can isolate. Or if it's a new site that we don't know, we can isolate. Or if it's not one of these approved ones, we can isolate. And so you actually can set rules around what isolates and what doesn't. It's
not full-blown isolation on the entire browser necessarily. Like every single web page I go to.
It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
So there's that balance of, if they're going to our internal applications, maybe we don't care. If they're using Zoom right now, maybe we don't care. We're not concerned about these things, but there are everything else we might be concerned about, or we're specifically concerned about these handful of things. It's that kind of thing. And we feed threat intelligence back in as well to give categories to start to select through. There's a lot of things like that. We're doing app groups. So like if you have Microsoft for Teams is a great example. There's like 400 or something domains that associate with that. Nobody wants to manually build that. Yeah. Well, you can go in there and just go Teams and I want to isolate or not isolate, or I want to block or not block, or you can put all the rules around it. Based on the actual apps themselves. So maybe Netflix is fine for you. Maybe YouTube's fine. Maybe this thing isn't, and so you can go like, I don't want people using Dropbox. So you can actually block Dropbox, or I don't want them going here, but if they do, it's not that big of a deal. Let me isolate instead because I'm worried about security threats. So you can actually start to work through policies that make sense in those, live through the products, if you will. It's that integration between them, at the end of the day.
I think Matt, we're bumping up right on your favorite.
I'm just gonna say, we learned some stuff today. We learned that we can talk a long time without Aaron being here. We learned that I by far have the worst hair of anyone on this episode. Not that I've been noticing that, but I did. And we also learned that if you only know Cloudflare from a CDN or a DNS security standpoint, you probably should really take another look, especially if you're dealing with any of the stuff that we were talking about today. And my guess is you probably are, because I think everyone is. So for those of you watching, please like, subscribe, share, all of that sort of fun stuff. And David, we really appreciate you being here. Hopefully we'll see you back up in West Michigan sometime, and we can all hang out when we're all able to do that again. For everyone else, we will see you for episode 18. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you.